Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome to Synth Stuff. Today is a day I've been waiting for a long time. It's the day that Novation finally released these patches for all the bugs in the Novation Summit. Coming up next. Well, it's been 2.5 years since the last firmware update from Novation for the Novation Summit, their flagship synthesizer. The original designer of the Summit, Chris Huggett, an absolute synthesizer genius who designed the Summit among many other classic synthesizers, unfortunately passed away, and a lot of the knowledge he held was lost. So it's taken Novation a long time to get this firmware update out to deal with many of the bugs that were in the Summit. Now, if you haven't seen my original video on the Summit, I did a very in-depth video on this synthesizer where I go through all the different features and then I talk about all the problems and bugs in the unit. And I really hoped that this firmware update would come and fix all those bugs because I really wanted to love this synthesizer. And now I really love this synthesizer. The major pain points, the biggest bugs that were really driving me crazy have been fixed. So I have to say that I can wholly recommend this synthesizer now because the bugs are fixed. It's good to go. Now, have all the bugs been fixed? No, there are some that I suspect can't be fixed because they are a design issue, but they are fairly corner case issues, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Along with the bug fixes, they've added many new features, so we're going to talk about those features as well. And this firmware update actually applies to both the Summit and the Peak. So if you have a Novation Peak, you should definitely update to this firmware because many of the bugs that were in the Peak are fixed, and some of the features that were exclusively to the Summit have now been moved over to the Peak. We'll talk about that as well. The update for this is super simple to do. You open Novation Components. If you see an update flag like you see here, that means your version of components needs to be updated before you do the firmware update. So if you see this here, make sure, even though you see firmware notification on the left, make sure you click update to update your components first before you do the firmware update. Once you've got your components up and running, you simply click on update, tell it to go. It sends the firmware update to the synthesizer. The synthesizer reboots, and then it does a number of things. It does a copy, and you can see it updating the FPGA here. And then once it's done, it's ready to go. Or is it? The first thing I noticed was all my patches are playing very softly. And the volume doesn't seem to have any effect. This was definitely not happening before I did the update, so let's try to power cycle this. And it's fixed. So if you have a problem with the volume in your Summit after doing the firmware update, definitely do a power cycle. In fact, I might suggest you just do a power cycle in any case after doing the update just to make sure everything's working correctly. All right, so let's talk about the different bugs that have been fixed. The VCA gain, which is the overall amount of gain on the VCA, which is the amplifier envelope, they didn't work on voices 9 through 16. They only worked on voices 1 through 8. That's been fixed. LFOs 3 and 4, if you modulated those to control different things on the synthesizer, worked only on voices 1 through 8 and not 9 through 16. That's been fixed. And the one that was killing me, the performance data over MIDI, things like mod wheel, breath control, expression, it would send them out, you could record them into your DAW, but when you sent them back, if it was playing voices 9 through 16, it didn't work. So especially mod wheel, that's just crazy. And the problem was when you use Summit with a DAW like I do, you could record your performance, but when you played it back, it only worked if it just happened to be playing voices 9 through 16 at that time. And there were some crazy workarounds to try to get around the problem, but it really was a huge problem. That's been fixed. You might have seen another video that I did on MIDI clock sync. I'll put a link to that down below as well. And one of the problems that the Summit had, along with several other synthesizers with the same issue, is that it was slow to sync to a MIDI clock. It would take a while. It might take a bar or two before it really synced up. That's fixed on this. It now syncs to the MIDI clock really quickly when it receives it. The Summit has FM capability where you can have each of the 3 oscillators modulate each other or frequency modulate each other and give you FM effects. The problem was if you changed those controls on the panel, it wasn't being sent or captured via MIDI. So you could make changes. I mean, you can make changes to any of the controls and have it send MIDI, and you can capture that in your DOS. You can capture it as part of the performance. However, the FM controls didn't work. It didn't send or receive over MIDI. That's been fixed. They now send NIRPin messages over MIDI, and they will receive them back and obey those instructions. Local off bug. There was a problem where if you turned local off, which basically means you don't want the controls on the synthesizer to actually directly affect the synthesizer engine. The controls in local off mode, you want the controls on the synthesizer to send over MIDI, and then something like your DAW would then echo them back to the synthesizer. The idea being that you don't end up with a MIDI loop. The problem was that the front panel controls would actually modify the engine even when local mode was turned off, which is incorrect. So that's been fixed. Aftertouch and performance data being sent over MIDI and multi-mode was all messed up. So you have channel 1 and channel 2, which are supposed to affect layer 1 and layer 2, and then the global channel, usually channel 3, which is supposed to affect both, and it just didn't work right at all. Now it does. Channel 1, or MIDI channel 1, is layer A, MIDI channel 2 is layer B, and then the global channel 3 affects both. And depending on the multi-mode you're in, it now works properly. So if you are in layer mode, something sent over the global channel will play on both layers. If you're in split mode, it obeys the split. So something you send below the split plays on channel A, and something you send above the split plays on channel B. If you're in dual mode, it plays whichever mode you have selected on the front panel. That's important because when you were trying to capture that in your DAW and then play it back, it wasn't playing back on the correct layers. So that's all fixed now. And the last bug they fixed was when you were in multi-mode and you were trying to search through the individual single patches, it was showing incorrect information. So that's fixed. Okay, so those are the bug fixes. Those are some of the most important ones, which are the MIDI ones. They were just killing me. What they didn't fix, there's some envelope bugs where the envelopes don't actually trigger correctly, and you can get some clicks and pops in if you have them set up in a specific way. Those, I don't know if they are going to be able to fix them. I suspect they might because it is FPGA driven and they can update the firmware in the FPGA. So hopefully that's something they can fix in the future. FX routing. This is one where the wet-dry routing of the effects are broken. It doesn't work correctly. They tried fixing it by changing the manual to say this is how it's supposed to work, but it's not how it's supposed to work. I have a feeling this might be hard and fast in the physical design of the unit. It might not be able to be fixed. Hopefully it can in a future update, but we'll see. Now let's talk about the new features added. Number 1 on the list is stereo capability with the oscillators. The oscillators could previously diverge left and right as you play them, called unispread. So if you had more instances of voices, they would start spreading out. So now you can manually tell each voice where in the stereo spectrum you want it, so you can manually pan it, which is really great. If you saw my binaural video, which I posted down below, I gave you a hack way of doing this, but now we can individually specify where we want voices to go. So we could do binaural sounds like an Udo Super 6. We can do that on the Summit without having to change wires or anything. You can do it in the programming of the sounds. That's amazing. So there's new stereo spread modes. Diverge is the one that used to be called unispread, where it works like it did before, where as you play more voices, they spread farther away from the center. Diverge 2 is a little bit different in that it round robins left and right, and the more you play, the wider it gets. Alternates left and right without spreading gradually like Diverge. It just sends it right out left and right, so each note you play plays on a different side. And Note Val is the same thing, except it remembers where individual notes were played. For instance, this is really great for an ARP. So say you have a 4-note ARP playing. If you want the first note to always be on the left, the second note will always be on the right, and so on. And it will remember where the individual notes of the arp are played, even if it's a random arp. So if you have a random arpeggio playing and you have this note valve turned on, it means that every time it plays the C of your arp, it'll be at this position. Every time it plays the F, it'll be over here. So it gives you a really solid locked-in arp effect. It's really cool sounding. The pan position of the voices is now a mod matrix destination, so you can actually have it panning left and right from the LFO, for instance. Or you could maybe have it set the key tracking, so the notes you play on the left side of the keyboard come out of the left side speaker, and as they gradually move across the keyboard to the right, they come out of the right side speaker. You could do anything you want. If you saw my original Summit video, you know one of my complaints was that you could easily bump the patch knob, and even if you were working on a patch, say you had spent half an hour doing sound design and changing all these controls until you got a sound that you really liked, and then you accidentally hit this knob, oops, all your work is gone. And there was no way of protecting against that. So one of the changes, my favorite change in this, I actually made a request that they fix this, and they really did well. So if we go into settings, you see on page 11 of settings, we have patch queue. If we just turn that on, now you can be in a patch, and if you switch to a different patch, you're in patch queue mode. So you can see all the different patches there are, and you get a star saying, hey, you're in patch. It's not actually switching to the new patch. And to switch to that patch, you'll see this button flashes here. If we're in single mode, the single one flashes. So if we're in multi-mode, now the multi one flashes. So in order to actually switch to the patch, you have to press the flashing button, which is just kind of a, are you sure? I'm going to leave this turned on forever because I love this feature. A couple more mod destinations. We now have an oscillator 1, 2, and 3 shape. So you can modulate the shape of all 3 oscillators as a destination. Previously, you had to do each oscillator individually. So if you wanted to do all 3 oscillators, you ate up 3 mod matrix slots. But now we have one that will do all 3 at once. So it gives you a little more flexibility. Another new modulation destination, the amp and mod 1 and 2 envelopes. You can now modulate the delay, hold, and sustain values for each of those envelope generators. We have 2 animate buttons that you can press, which you can use latched or momentarily, that will alter the sound. But one of the problems with these animate buttons is that when you press them, it suddenly changes to the new sound. Well, now the animate buttons have attack and release envelopes associated with them, so you can gradually change to a new sound, in and out of a new sound when you activate or deactivate them. LFOs 3 and 4 are global LFOs. They don't work with individual voices, and there's been new features added to them. All these features exist in LFOs 1 and 2, but now they exist in LFOs 3 and 4 as well. The first is slew, where it kind of rounds off the sharp edges of the LFOs. The second is phase. Now, phase normally relates to where does the LFO start in the waveform when you press a key, but LFOs 3 and 4 are global. They're not triggered by keys. So how do they go about that? Well, what they do is they have it reset when there are no notes playing. And then when you press the first note that you're starting to play, it starts off LFOs 3 and 4 at the specific point in their phase. So that's a kind of a neat way of locking LFOs 3 and 4 into key playing without actually having them associated with key individual voices being played. Also, LFOs 3 and 4 get fade time, so the depth value of the LFO 3 and 4, you can actually fade in how much that is being affected over time. And there are 12 new FX mod destinations, which is really nice. I'm not going to go through them all one by one, but I am showing them here on the screen. So all of these values can now be modulated by the mod matrix, the FX mod matrix. The chorus and flanger effects now have more options to affect their detuning. There's quite a bit of detail in this. If you are interested in this, I definitely advise you to read the release notes on this. I'm not going to try and get into the hoary details of all the different features they've added to these, but they do sound great. Delay has a new parameter called time mode, and I don't know why they called it that, but time mode is basically sample rate. So what it lets you do is alter the sample rate. You can give it a really low sample rate, so your delay can kind of acquire a lo-fi characteristic. The arpeggiator gets a couple new features. It has a chance where you can set between 10 and 100% chance, which means if you set it at 50%, for instance, when you play an ARP, there's only a 50% chance each individual note will sound. So it gives you a little bit of variation as it's playing. In that case, 50% of the time it would play a rest instead of an individual note in the ARP. There's also a chord version of this, so it will play either the entire chord, maybe 50% of the time, or you can also set it so that it will play individual notes within the chord 50% of the time. So if you say have a 4-note chord and it's playing, that chord is actually going to change every time the ARP plays, which gives it a little bit motion and keeps your ARPs from sounding too static. There were some items that were only in the Summit that have been added to the Peak. Those are amp and modulation delay, a high-pass filter on your noise oscillator, and some of the effects mod destinations that were in the Summit have now also been added to the Peak. Some items that were added only to the Summit and not to the Peak, obviously because they have to do with keyboard. In the Summit local mode, there's a sequencer mode that allows you to use Summit with an external sequencer in a specific way that does not cause a MIDI loop. This is a really corner case. It basically lets you send things like pitch bend and mod wheel out, but not other things over MIDI. Again, if you use Summit with an external sequencer and you're having a problem with MIDI loops, have a look at the release notes of this firmware release and you'll see if this is going to help you. The other thing that got added to Summit and not Peak is aftertouch scaling. I know the aftertouch on the Summit is pretty stiff, so you can actually change the scaling of that. It doesn't make it more sensitive, but it changes how quickly the aftertouch comes into effect. It basically changes the aftertouch curve. And that's it. That's all the new features in this firmware release. I can't say how pleased I am that this has finally come. I know a lot of people have been waiting for this for a long time. Novation kept saying, it's coming soon, coming soon. They've been saying that for over a year, and some people were starting to believe that maybe it was not going to come. I know I've read about some people online who have sold their Summits because they just got frustrated, but and I definitely know I've seen many comments from people, including on my own video, where after they saw the video and they realized all the bugs that were in there, they said, oh, I really wanted to buy one of these, but I'm not going to now. So hopefully those people will come back, because this is a fantastic synthesizer. It sounds so good. I can't say all the bugs, but a lot of the bugs, the most painful bugs, have been fixed, and we're ready to go. So if you were on the fence thinking about a Summit and not pulling the trigger because of bugs, well, now's the time. Pull that trigger, get it done. I hope this is of some use to you. If you like what you saw here, please click like and subscribe. Click that little bell down below. It really helps us out when you do that, and you get notified every time we post a new video. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer all of them. Thanks for watching.